Thanks, everyone, and thanks for your attention so far this morning. We have a real privilege today to hear from someone who survived the events from 80 years ago. Mr. Alex Buckman is a child survivor of the Holocaust from Belgium. He survived while in hiding. Today, he's the president of the Vancouver Child Survivor Group. He's spoken to thousands of students as a Vancouver Holocaust education outreach speaker. I would introduce more about Alex, but he's going to do a much better job of doing that himself. So please do welcome Mr. Alex Buckman.
I will share with you what happened to my family and I. Could you hear me in the back? Okay. I'm quiet because I'm thinking. I'm thinking, and I'm going to share all of it with you. So give me a chance. My grandparents were born in Poland, and they were with their 11 children in a little village called Jeso. Friends of the family moved away from Poland and they went to Belgium. They wrote to the family and asked them to move. My grandparents didn't want to go, but my mother wanted to go, and she asked permission to her parents, and her parents refused. Why did they refuse? My mother was only 16 years old. What my mother wanted to do was to take her 4 sisters with her to go to Belgium, take care of them. But after that, she convinced her parents to leave. And they finally said, okay. So they left Poland to go to Belgium. There, their friends found them an apartment. My mother worked, and she did all sorts of work just to make a little bit of money. At first, she cleaned houses. Then, when she had enough money, she bought a sewing machine. And she learned how to make corsets for women. And her aim was to work at home, take care of her sister, and also make a little bit of money. My father was born in Belgium, and he also worked at home. He had a leather sewing machine, and he made briefcases. What he did, he sold them to retail stores. Their friends introduced my mother to my father. They fell in love. They courted, they got married. On October 31st, 1939, I was born in Brussels, Belgium. On May the 10th, 1940, just a few months after I was born, the Germans invaded Belgium. Everything changed for Jewish people. My family and I are Jewish. And the Nazis told the Belgian population that they weren't allowed to help the Jews. They weren't allowed to help people to take care of little babies like myself. My father, he hired a woman to try to find Belgian families, non-Jewish Belgian families, to take care of me. So I went from families to more than a dozen different families from the age of 2 to 4. At 4, a family brought me home, and a woman was sitting in the kitchen, and my father told me to come close to her. He introduced me to her, and her name was Mademoiselle André. He said that I was going to go on a long trip with her, to be a good boy, to listen to her, and it was going to be very difficult to go. And then I asked him, where is Mama? And my father told me that she was in the bedroom and not to disturb her because she wasn't feeling well. I didn't listen to my father, and I ran to the bedroom. I wanted to open it, and I couldn't do it. I didn't know why. It felt like as if somebody was holding the doorknob. We didn't have any keys to our doors. I didn't understand. I went back. Mademoiselle André stood up and she said, "We have to leave." My father hugged and kissed me. That would be the last time that my father kissed me. I was 4 years old. Mademoiselle André took me to the street and we walked. She walked so fast I had to run beside her. Then we stopped at a little truck. She put me in the back and we drove away. I didn't know where we were going, but later on she told me we were going to an orphanage. And she told me not to say anything because the Nazis were all over the place. I had to be quiet. I never said a word for 4 days. After 4 days, we stopped and she said, "We're there and you'll be able to go and sleep soon." She rang the bell. A woman came to see her and they talked a little bit. Then Mademoiselle André came and she kissed me on both cheeks and she left. I didn't realize it at the time that Mademoiselle André had saved my life. The new lady brought me in and she said, "Get undressed." And she brought me into a dormitory. All the boys were sleeping. And she asked me to jump into bed. I did. She shut the lights. And then I realized I'd never said goodbye to my mother and I cried myself to sleep. My father and my mother had a tough time to take care of a child and didn't know what to do, but after a while they decided to place me in an orphanage. And that was to save my life. My father also made sure that his niece, my cousin Annie, was going to be in the same orphanage with me. And then he asked the people in the orphanage to have our names, our last names changed so that Annie's name and my name would be the same. We would be known as brother and sister instead of cousins. Why did he do that? He did it because just in case that our parents would be taken away by the Gestapo, we would stay together. As a matter of fact, the lady who was helping my father to find families to hide me, she denounced my parents to the Gestapo. In the middle of the night, they came, knocked at the door, and my parents had to open the door, and there they were. The Gestapo came to take my parents away. They told my parents to take a few clothes in a little valise and to follow them. They did. Outside, on the street, there was a big truck waiting for them. They climbed in and they saw their neighbors was already in there. The truck took them to Malines. Malines was a couple of hours from Brussels. There they had to wait to be sent to a concentration camp. My aunt and uncle, Annie's parents, my father's sister, Rebecca known as Becky, they were also taken by the Gestapo. The same lady who denounced my parents denounced my aunt and uncle. And they were sent to Malines, where they met my parents. After a few weeks, my aunt Becky was sent to a place called Ravensbrück. My uncle was sent to a place called Buchenwald. But my parents were sent to a place called Auschwitz. Auschwitz was in Poland. When my father and mother went to Poland, went to Auschwitz, they arrived there in the middle of the night by train, and they were greeted by the Nazis and with their big dogs. I'm sure that my mother must have been scared out of her mind. The men and the women were separated. And the man, before they went to work, Those who would go to work were tattooed with numbers on their arm. My father, with other men, had to stand in line for hours and hours. And unfortunately, my father, he suffered a flat feet. And when you stand still in one place, it's very tiring. My father became weak. He couldn't work. In Auschwitz, there was no room for weak people who couldn't work. My mother was sent on the other side. She was sent to Auschwitz number 2, better known as Birkenau. There she met one of her sisters that was already there. Her name was Frida. They hugged and kissed. And in the morning, there were men in white coats who were in charge of the triage. The triage meant they would be the one that would decide who would go to work and who would not. But in reality, the one who would not go to work would go to a different place. My mother was chosen to go to the right. And to the right, it meant that all these women that were there would go to work. Unfortunately, her sister was sent to the left. My mother turned around and she talked to the lady behind her. That lady knew the two sisters, knew the families in Brussels, Belgium. And my mother told her, "Look, my sister Frida's on the other side. What should I do?" And the lady replied, "Do what you want." My mother looked at her sister and she was crying. She wanted to stay in the right, but at the same time she wanted to be with her sister. So she went over to her sister. And my Aunt Frida told my mother, "Go back. Go back, you shouldn't be here." My mother thought about it and finally she decided she would go back. But the Nazis stopped her. She couldn't go back. My mother and her sister, hand in hand, followed all these other women who the Nazis thought that they couldn't work. She followed the women with the children and the babies and the elderly, and they all walked together slowly. And the Nazis would yell at them to go faster. And while they were walking towards a room, an orchestra was playing classical music. My Aunt Becky, Rebecca Buckman Teitelbaum, she was my father's sister. Before the war, she worked in the office of a large department store called L'Innovation. But in Ravensbrück, where she had a tough job. With other women, they had to push a cart all the way to the forest, and they had to pick up wood for their little stove in their barack. Barack was the place where they slept. And it was in November, winter of 1943. It was very, very cold and snowy. They hardly had any clothes, definitely didn't have proper shoes to walk into the mud. And it was tough. And when she came back, the cart was full of wood, and it was tough to push it through those muddy roads. And she felt when she came back to her barack that if she continued this way, she would not be able to survive. It was too tough. A friend of Becky came running to her and she said, "Becky, I heard that there's a factory right attached to Ravensbrück, a factory called Siemens. And listen to what I heard. I heard that they're looking for prisoners to work in the office. With your experience, you should try to apply for the job." Becky thanked her. She had in her pocket, she had a little piece of a mirror, and she looked at herself, and she thought that she didn't look great. She thought she looked awful. And she combed her hair, and she looked again, and she saw how pale she was. And then she had an idea. She took a needle and she pricked the tips of her fingers, and she took the blood from her fingers and she applied it on both cheeks. And then she pinched her cheeks to give her a little bit of color. And then she ran towards that factory and she applied for the job to work in the office. And because of her past experience at l'Innovation in Brussels, Belgium, they gave her the job immediately. She was so happy and she thought she was lucky. And sometimes she'd work there during the day and sometimes she worked there at night. And in one of these evenings, one time she saw a roll of brown paper and she had an idea. It was a dangerous idea, but she wanted to do something special. She wanted to do something in defiance. And when she looked around and she thought that nobody was looking at her, she took a big piece of this brown paper and she put it in her dress. And then she stole a little pencil and she stole a little pair of scissors. And at night, she ran back to her barack. She was very, very nervous. If caught, no questions asked, they would have hanged her in front of all the prisoners for stealing the pencil and the pair of scissors. When she came into her barack, she looked for an empty spot on the floor and she took this big brown paper and she cut little pieces. And she took her pencil and then she started to write 2, 4, 6, 8. And what did she write? She wrote recipes. Recipes. Recipes of food that she made for her husband before she went in Ravensbrück. And many recipes that she wrote, because I read them all, many recipes that she wrote, she exaggerated. And after she told me she exaggerated in purpose because they were always hungry in Ravensbrück. So the recipes were, instead of being so much for butter, she increased the recipes. Becky spent 16 months in that concentration camp. Then came liberation, and trucks were coming to take all the prisoners back to their countries. They were going to go to Belgium, to France, to Holland, to all European countries. And they were so happy to leave that concentration camp. They climbed into the trucks, and as the trucks were leaving, they didn't know it. Planes were flying above them. They don't know why, but some of the planes, they dropped some bombs. Some of the trucks full of women blew up. Then they yelled to all the women to jump off the trucks, those who were still alive, and then to hide as best they could near the ravine, near the road. Becky was one of them. After the bombing stopped, they asked all the women to come back to the trucks, and Becky saw that she had blood on her hand. She didn't know what it was. She touched her arm, and a piece of her upper arm was missing. With the help of others, she climbed into that truck, and she was holding a little bag in her hand. And she lost so much blood, she fainted, and she dropped the bag. In the hospital, was in Copenhagen. In the hospital, she was very lucky. They saved her arm. And then she stayed there. And then one day in the hospital, she received a telegram. And the telegram came from her husband that he had survived and he was in Belgium waiting for Becky. And he was waiting there with her daughter. Now she was anxious to go home. Her husband was alive and her daughter as well. And then they flew her back to Belgium. She met her husband when she arrived. And her husband told her that Alex is sleeping in the same room with Annie, and he doesn't know anything about his parents. And Becky was anxious to see her daughter. She opened the door, she went to her daughter, she kissed and hugged, and she told her that she was her mother. She came close to me, and I said, "Bonjour, maman." Becky cried and she left. After all that, when we came back from the orphanage, Annie and I were not in great shape. Becky took us to the doctor, and he told her that I wasn't very well and that I should be taken to the sea. Becky and her husband just came back from concentration camp. They didn't have money to take me to the sea. So Becky went to see my 3 aunts, my mother's sisters, and asked if they were going to the sea. And one of them said yes. And Becky asked her if they would take Alex to the sea. She accepted. Before I left, and going back a little bit in time, the orphanage was situated on top of a hill, and it's situated in Namur, 2 hours from Brussels. All the kids would normally play in a big room. And when the people who were in charge of the orphanage, they would see trucks with Nazis coming, and they knew immediately that they were coming for an inspection. They would run from this place to another big hall, and they would push all the furniture on the side, lift the carpets, open 2 big wooden doors, and then they would run back to where all the kids were playing, and they would pick and choose boys, only boys. I was one of them. They asked us to follow them. We did. They brought us close to the cellar. They told us that we had to walk down and that we couldn't make any noise. We looked down and it was pitch black. And we were scared. We were scared of the dark. We started to cry. And we asked them, "Why are you punishing us? We didn't do anything." And they said, "We're not punishing you, but you have to go into the cellar." And we continued to cry. We didn't want to go. We were scared. Then they gave us a little piece of cloth. And they said, "If you are scared and if you have to cry, maybe this little piece of cloth will help you not to make too much noise." And gently they came down and they pushed us down. We had to go into the cellar. Then they shut those 2 wooden doors, put back the carpet and the furniture, and it was pitch black, completely black. It was scary, and we saw things running around us, so we didn't know what it was. And later on, they told us they were rats. And it was quiet, so quiet. But kids were crying, and we told them to hush up. But they couldn't. How do you stop a child to cry? Then we heard noise, loud noise, over our heads. We didn't know what it was. And we heard people screaming in a language we didn't understand. And this went on and on and on. And then it became quiet again. And we didn't know what was happening. And it was scary. Then all of a sudden we heard the shuffling of the furniture and the carpets lifting up. And the 2 wooden doors opened up and there was light. And then they asked us to come out. And we were embarrassed because in the cellar we were so cold and we were so scared that we peed our pants. And we were embarrassed to come out. We didn't want to come out. And they told us that it didn't matter, that they were going to give us a warm bath. Finally, we did come out. That situation occurred from the age of 4 to 6.5. Liberation came, and parents were coming to take their children away, but no one came for us. And Annie was crying, and I tried to console her, and I told her that our parents would come soon, but they didn't come. And then the orphanage decided that they were going to keep all the children. Their parents didn't come to pick them up. They were going to keep us for another 6 months, with the hope that our parents would come soon, but they didn't. So finally the orphanage drove us all the way from Namur back to Brussels. There in Brussels we were transferred to the Red Cross. And the Red Cross took our names on long sheets, wrote them in big thick letters, and they placed our names on telephone poles all over Brussels with the hope that members of their family would find us. Then with another Jewish organization, they had decided to put all the Jewish orphans and then to send them to Palestine before Israel, and to send them to a kibbutz. We were happy to go to Palestine, but within days of leaving to go there, our uncle Jacques, my father's brother, Becky's brother, he found us, and he came to pick us up at the Red Cross. He brought us home. He introduced Annie to her father. She called him Papa. In the orphanage, Annie was my sister. Therefore, I called him Papa as well. So when Becky came back from the hospital, all of a sudden, Becky and her husband had 2 children instead of 1. When finally I went with one of my aunts to the sea, I was so happy to go with them, and my uncle was going to come and pick me up. I was more excited to go into his car. I had never been in a car, and he came with his Citroën, brought us to the sea, and when I saw the waves of the sea for the first time, I was so excited. And within a few days, there was a castle contest, sand castle contest. And all the children could enter, but before you enter, you had to buy a jar of Nescafe. I didn't have the money to buy the cafe, but my cousin Joe, he had the money. So he bought the coffee, and he was ready to do his little castle, so he made his castle. Oh, it was awful. And I looked at it, and I guess I was jealous. I wasn't allowed to do my own little castle. And I saw the judges who were going to come and maybe give prizes. And I went over, and I broke it with my foot. He was so mad at me. He punched me in the nose. And I started to bleed. And I said, "I'll tell my mother on you." And that's when he told me. He was very mad because I broke his castle. That's when he told me that your mother and father are dead. And I said, "You're crazy, it's impossible. They're at home, they're waiting for me." And he yelled at me and he said, "No, they're not your parents." And I I lost it. I ran away. And that night the police found me sitting on the beach. They brought me back to my aunt Adassa, Joe's mother. And I asked her, is it true what Joe told me that my parents are dead? And she told me, I'll drive you home. I went home and Becky was at the door. And I ran to her and I asked her, are you my mother? And she took my hand. She told me that my parents were taken to Auschwitz, and that was in Poland, and that they never came back. When I found out I was 7 years old, I cried. And for the first time in a long time, I felt so alone. So she took me to the bedroom, and I tried to sleep. Time went by, time passed. I'm in the year 2010, and I was honored as the first survivor in Vancouver to go on the March of the Living. The March of the Living, you have two people going with a group of Jewish students. I went with 11 students from King David High School, and we went. It was 1 week in Poland and 1 week in Israel. When we went, we weren't alone. Other groups, just like ours, from all the provinces of Canada, were going at the same time. And we met in Poland. I remember the first day that I went to Poland, they asked me to speak in an orphanage there in Warsaw. I was emotional because that orphanage reminded me of the orphanage that I was in when I was a little boy. And here I was in an orphanage as a grown-up trying to tell them what happened in Poland. And we went from one concentration camp to another concentration camp. But I was anxious to see Auschwitz, where my parents had been. And here we were in the year 2010, and I had to think that they were in 1943. And we walked in for the first time on the last day that we were in Poland, in Auschwitz. It's almost too tough to describe the feeling that I had to walk into that place. As you walked in, on both sides, there were shoes, many, many, many shoes. They even had little shoes. When I walked by them, I caressed a little pair. And we continued to walk. And there was a mountain, big mountain of glasses, spectacles, all tangled up together. And there was a sign that said that all these glasses belonged to Jewish prisoners that were there back in 1943. And we continued to walk, and the people inside, they were crying. Then we stopped at a sign in front of big glass, and behind the glass was a big mountain. A big mountain of hair. Hair belonging to women and young girls. We had to stop. Everybody was crying. Then finally we walked into a room. It was the room where my mother and her sister, my aunt Frida, had been back in November 1943. It was cold. It was freezing cold, and they had told us before we went to Auschwitz, they had told it that it would be cold. And they told us not to forget to wear warm clothes and to bring our hats and scarves and gloves. But some of the students forgot. And they were crying because they were freezing. And I remember giving my scarf and my gloves to some of the students. Then they were told that they were going to take a shower. And we thought how crazy it is. We were cold in April 2010. And they, in November 1943, were going to be naked and taking showers. And then they told them to take their clothes off and put them beside them. And take their shoes and tie their shoes together and put their shoes next to their clothes. And other prisoners came and took their clothes and shoes away. And they promised to bring them back after their showers with lies. They were telling them lies, nothing but lies. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure that my mother and her sister must have looked up at the shower heads and were hoping that the water would come down. But the water didn't come down, and they didn't know why. And the women were panicking, and they came down and they scratched the walls with their fingernails. They wanted to escape, but they couldn't escape because all the doors were locked. And what they didn't know was that the Nazi that placed above the shower heads, they had placed poison. And then they told us that in November 1943, all the women and children and babies and the elderly all died in that room. They murdered my mother, who was in Auschwitz II, better known as Birkenau, at the age of 32. And they murdered my father in Auschwitz I at the age of 31. At 7, at Coq-sur-Mer in Belgium, I found out that I was an orphan. And I just knew without anybody telling me that life for me would be so different. So completely different. The Nazis murdered 6 million, we all know that. But what we tend to forget at times is that amongst the 6 million, there was 1.5 million Jewish kids that were there too. 1.5 million Jewish children. They represented, at the time, 93% of all the Jewish kids that were murdered. I am a child survivor with the remaining 7% of Jewish kids. My father and my mother never did anything wrong to anybody, and their only crime was that they were Jews. I witnessed what happened when I was a child. When I share this with all of you, you become witnesses. Later on, you will be able to ask me questions. Thank you very much.
I have a script in front of me, but I'm speechless. I don't really know what to say after that. Mr. Buckman, thank you so much for sharing that story. An emotionally exhausting tale. Some deep historical lessons that we can all take from it about the nature of what it is to be a human. We're going to have a break now. Over the break, please do think about questions you'd like to ask both Mr. Buckman and our historian about what we've heard so far this morning. During the break, you can go to the Friesen Center, and while you're there, we're going to be serving orange cake. And it's orange cake made from the recipe of Mr. Buckman's aunt. Please be back in your seats at 11 o'clock. Thank you.